Thanks. Thank you, Graham. So what I want to talk to you today about, like Graham mentioned, is actually my PhD research from geography here at UBC. And I'm going to talk to you about the revival and the reinstitutionalization of various historic social practices and forms of knowledge exchange in the Peruvian Andes, in order to ask the question about whether that revival and reincorporation in environmental governance frameworks undermines any of the decolonial potential that these historic practices may have today. So just to unpack that somewhat in terms of some different phraseology, I'll be focusing on how place-based forms of knowledge exchange, these are the social practices that are being revived, particular ways of sharing knowledge, how those forms of knowledge exchange and environmental governance frameworks are co-constituted, or how a decolonial option rooted in indigenous knowledge is tied to its other, and that is post-colonial governance. So just to, before I go on to elaborate something of an outline for what I'm going to talk about in more general terms, just to point to the components of the talk somewhat. When I'm talking about knowledge exchange and indigenous knowledge, I'm going to be referring to a group of individuals known as Kamayok, and I'm going to explain that term a little bit more as we go along. But essentially these are adult peer-to-peer educators in the Southern Andes. And when I talk about environmental governance frameworks, I'm going to be referring largely to the institution known as IPEBA. I'll spell that out in more detail later on, but this is a government institute designed to revive rural productivity and adult education in the Southern Andes. So I'll do this more or less in three parts. I'll just develop a bit of the context and background for you on the role of these Kamayok in the Peruvian Andes. I'll then bring in the element from the title around decolonization as a metaphor and decolonization as practice, in order to position the debate somewhat about the role of the Kamayok today. And then I'm going to spend most of the time, I hope, actually unpacking what it means for the Kamayok to interrelate, be incorporated within these environmental governance frameworks, such as the institutional architecture that is IPEBA. So to tell this story, I'm going to focus on the Southern Andes of Peru. This is where most of my research was conducted, in the departments of Cusco and Apurimac. This is historically where Kamayok practices have been centered, as I'll explain. But telling the story from this place also means bringing in the role of this NGO, Soluciones Prácticas, the Latin American head arm of the UK-based NGO called Practical Action. The tagline is Technology Challenging Poverty. This NGO has been involved in training Kamayok for about 3 decades, and they have what they call the Kamayok School, which isn't a physical place, it's a training program that's been centered in the department of Cusco. To explore the relationship with environmental governance frameworks and the role of IPEBA, I need to bring in, that's the Kamayok they're training. We need to bring in this element of certification. So the IPEBA institutional setup is designed to certify Kamayok as formal promoters in the Peruvian Andes. So if we bring in IPEBA, we see a shift from training farmers, Kamayok as farmer trainers, to professionalizing and certifying Kamayok as a certain type of rural promoter or rural extensionist. And I'm going to unpack a bit more about these terms as we go through. I'll begin by explaining a bit more about who these Kamayok are. We can essentially gloss the term as agents of change, agents of transformation, or agents of animation based on an interpretation of the word Kamai. But they've been interpreted by NGOs who have been training in Kamayok over the last 3 decades as specialists, so community-based specialists in Andean communities within what they call a farmer-to-farmer extension model, so campesino a campesino, whereby these farmers train other farmers in order to improve their environmental governance practices and their techniques and their productivity levels, as I'll explain. They've also been characterized as leaders, and they characterize themselves as leaders in their communities as well. They have a certain responsibility in order to educate their fellow campesinos, and they are supposed to be selected or elected by communities. They've been described by Carlos de la Torre, who's a significant actor in this story. He worked with the Kamayok for 3 decades while working for Soluciones Prácticas. He described them as culturally appropriate, transcultural bridges grounding adult environmental education in Quechua culture and language. So this is where the sort of decolonial potential comes in of grounding, regrounding education in Quechua realities and cultures. So, yes. The individuals or the term? Yeah. But the individuals, it gets a bit more complex. But yeah, the term descends from Quechua, yeah. In this particular region, yeah. So what exactly do they do? This peer-to-peer learning revolves around learning by doing, or grounded co-learning in the field. It could be about animal health, such as dealing with parasites in alpacas. It could do with the reproductive health of cattle. It could be to do with introducing new inputs like nutritional supplements, antibiotics, and so on into cattle. It also has to do, the training that they're engaged in and the knowledge that they extend also has to do with the productive element from these animals, from the livestock, particularly revolving around reviving traditional weaving practices, for example, and then improving the marketing techniques of those products and extending them to markets. They've also been involved in reviving traditional practices in environmental management more broadly, particularly in reviving traditional irrigation techniques and technologies, and in combining those with modern influences in order to improve irrigation and water management. And there's a historical justification to all of this. And the reason that the NGOs have been so engaged in bringing Camel back is because of this history. So they justify this according to the role of the Camel under previous social or societies, including under the Inca. The Quipu Camel were accountants for Inca nobility. The Chakra Camel were agricultural specialists. And the Yanka and Guaca Camel were responsible for certain mythological components of Andean societies. And contemporary revival of Camel focuses on this productive component. I'm not going to spell out all of these different types, but suffice to say that before the Spanish arrived, there were a variety of different Camel engaged in various productive techniques of managing the environment and ensuring that production was upheld in a regional sense. So this history has been incorporated into NGO discourses in order to justify why the Camel are now taking a part in managing production and environments within these NGO projects. But increasingly the training of Camel, rather than being part of this dynamic co-learning, is happening in scenarios like this, where a room full of Camel hopefuls are being professed to by a selection of NGO staff and specialists. So they're in a room, sitting down, learning in theoretical ways about what should and should not be Camel knowledge and practice, and I'm going to show how that starts to take shape more specifically. The outcome of this process is now being incorporated into the certification program being led by the Peruvian state. So they get trained in these capacity building scenarios. They then go through a year-long process and then take some exams at the end according to a set of indicators that I'm going to really unpack a little bit later on. And then they get a certificate like this one. And they take this certificate and they can use it as a justification for getting employment with NGOs, for working for municipalities, or just to get a sense of legitimacy with their fellow campesinos so that they can either sell their knowledge exchange practices or what have you. So it's a way of recognizing the Camel as certain specialists and expertise in Andean communities. So what I'm going to focus on is largely this component. What it means to take this historic role of the Camel and the way in which they've been participating in NGO programs to then embed it into a state program that is now trying to spatially expand this nationwide to a national program of certification. What does it mean for Camel, who are Quechua and who have been ingrained in life in Cusco and in the southern Andes, to then take this into a model that's being implemented nationwide in Peru? And that tension is why I want to frame it in terms of the metaphor and practice of decolonization, and perhaps to explore the Camel as a grounded articulation of the decolonial option. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of this framing before I start to really unpack the role of the APEBA system. Decolonization as a metaphor revolves around a paper that was published in the very first issue of Decolonization, which is a journal produced here at UBC by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. And the central argument here was that decolonizing strategies have to be unsettling. Anything that's not unsettling is not decolonial. And they actually pick on Paulo Freire's radical pedagogy, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Paulo Freire basically argued that we need to redesign education by and for oppressed peoples, to no longer have a top-down system of education. Tuck and Yang argued that this isn't decolonial because he didn't identify the causes of oppression, in their opinion, colonization. So their point is you can't just call something decolonial, like a Freirean radical pedagogy, if you don't actually unsettle and challenge the causes of oppression, being colonialism. This is important because the Camelliac have been framed in terms of Paulo Freire's radical pedagogy. The NGO Soluciones Prácticas has been involved with the Camelliac for decades, casts them in terms of trying to overturn the top-down system of education in the Peruvian Andes. But Tuck and Yang go on to say that decolonization is not a metaphor for the general things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Describing all struggles as decolonial creates a convenient ambiguity, particularly for the colonizers. And I'm going to pick apart some of this ambiguity in the section that follows. So decolonize, a verb, and decolonization, a noun, cannot be grafted onto pre-existing discourses and frameworks. And that's the component I'm going to focus on. If we graft the Camelliac and the historic practices onto the government program of the PABA, what does that mean for the Camelliac and for that government program, for that matter? And just to finish up on this point, they also argue that decolonization can exist as a theoretical project and is not obliged to answer practical questions. And the example they give is what reconciliation might look like in practice. And I end with this because I want to contrast it to some work coming out of the Peruvian Andes, or of the Andes in general, around decolonization, that frames decolonization particularly in terms of praxis. And this builds on the work of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. She's a Bolivian indigenous activist and scholar. Her main point, in contrast to Tuck and Yang, is that there can be no discourse or theory without a decolonizing practice. Theoretical discourses are actually essentialist interpretations of indigenous questions. We can have a debate afterwards about the degree to which I am participating in that. But the point is that it's all about practice, not about theory, unlike Tuck and Yang's argument. And terms like decolonial may actually paralyze the objects of study. In her case, she used the example of indigenous and African descended people with whom academics like me believe they are in dialogue. So we need to focus on the reviving of practices rather than talking about decolonization as a theoretical project. So for Silvia Rivera, indigenous commitment to modernity looks for difference and not homogeneity, and the example she gives is bilingualism. So this is difference being practiced in everyday life, and again this is significant because the Camelliac have also been cast in terms of their ability to uphold bilingualism and intercultural education in the Peruvian Andes. So on the one hand we have this Freirean framing, which has been cast as a metaphor for decolonization. On the other hand, we have this bilingualism that's been framing the Camelliac, which could be argued is a form of decolonial practice. I'm not going to argue one way or the other, but these are two different ways in which the Camelliac have been framed. So in the Andes, just to sum up on this sort of theoretical component, decolonial scholars and practitioners have been drawing attention to a wide range of historic social practices that can re-embed Andean agrarian ecologies, and the Camelliac are one component of this. As historically constituted, practical educators engaged in reciprocal forms of co-learning that help to uphold the collective relations of Andean agrarian ecologies. Down here I've listed some others that are often used alongside the CAMAOC and so on. If anyone's interested, I'm not going to go into any detail about those. So in terms of this framing, really the question that I want to ask is, as the bilingual, reciprocal forms of environmental knowledge exchange that are upheld by the CAMAOC are associated, or that are grafted onto NGO and state programs, do CAMAOC practices transform into a post-colonial metaphor for decolonization? So I'm going to unpack that in this third section by looking at the example of how CAMAOC are integrated into that IPEBA structure of environmental governance. So section 3, CAMAOC knowledge and environmental governance frameworks. What are the effects of these environmental governance frameworks on these peer-to-peer knowledge exchange systems that the CAMAOC are engaged in? Coming back to this topic means also coming back to Soluciones Prácticas, or Practical Action, the NGO that's been training CAMAOC since the 1980s. Their program is based on three fundamental components. One is community-based extension systems. So this idea that in communities we have peer-to-peer training mechanisms that uphold community forms of development. And this in Peru is based on the campesino a campesino model, this farmer-to-farmer model, of which the CAMAOC are one component, a culturally appropriate, embedded component of this campesino a campesino model. We also need to bring back the Government Institute of IPEBA, the Peruvian Institute for the Evaluation, Accreditation, and Certification of the Quality of Basic Education. They too have a threefold kind of framing. One is around intercultural education and bilingual education. Second is productivity, employability, and competitiveness in rural areas of Peru. And they attempt to deliver on these elements by establishing a nationwide network of rural extensionists. So the CAMAOC are one culturally specific variant of these rural extensionists. The CAMAOC exist in Cusco and Apurímac, are one variant of these rural extensionists that the Peruvian state is trying to create a network of nationwide. So I'm going to basically look at how this component around Soluciones Prácticas and the CAMAOC is embedded and incorporated into the IPEBA framework, nationally speaking. So I'll return us to the map of the Southern Andes. What I'm going to do in the first part is talk about the training programs in Cusco and how they're embedded in the IPEBA framework, largely around livestock that emerged from the Escuela de CAMAOC, the CAMAOC school established by the NGO Soluciones Prácticas. I'm then going to shift to a newer project, Proyecto Pacocha, which just means Project Alpaca, that was introduced as part of an experiment, introduced by Soluciones Prácticas as part of an experiment within this overarching framework of IPEBA. So just to set up the role of IPEBA here in the ways in which CAMAOC integrate into IPEBA, it was set up in 2007 by the Peruvian state institution CINIASE, which was established to govern educational reform in its entirety. So that is a legal framework for reforming quality education, defined in their terms in their documents and in interviews and in their great literature and so on, defined in terms of employability, sustainability, and replicability. And these are quite important framing devices for what they're trying to do. CINIASE established 3 institutions. I'm just going to focus on IPEBA, which is oriented towards governing basic education, and that includes basic adult education. Because a lot of people in the Andes have not finished very many levels of schooling. So here's the framework. You don't need to be able to pick apart the whole framework. This is just how it was at its inception. And we're going to focus on the left-hand side, just to show you the hierarchy within which CAMAOC are now participating. We have CINIASE, that large government institution at the top. The 3 sub-institutions, we're going to focus on IPEBA. IPEBA has 2 mandates. We're going to largely ignore the technical institutes and focus on this component. So APEBA accredits some partner institutions. It basically gives them a license to go and train these rural promoters. At the time, there were 3 involved, and these other 2, well, there were 3, Soluciones Prácticas, Amarcas, and Gloria. Gloria and Amarcas are important, but I don't have time to get into them. Amarcas is a regional association of Camayoc, and Gloria is a large dairy corporation, the largest in South America, I think. So these are entirely different institutions, and that is an entirely different conversation that we can get into afterwards. But if we focus on the left, Soluciones Prácticas is accredited by APEBA to train and certify Camayoc. And it does that by, first of all, establishing a network of its own individual accredited evaluators. These individuals go out into the field, train, and certify Camayoc. This process takes about a year of training, followed by the exams of the Camayoc, performing and illustrating how they are able to be Camayoc. At the end, we have Camayoc certified as formal livestock promoters, or rural extensionists, or whatever term you want to pick out of their literature. So that's how we end up in a situation like this. These Camayoc have gone through a process of training for a year in a specific specialization, and they've then illustrated their knowledge and their skills in that area of specialization, and they get given this certificate that illustrates their competencies. So I'm just going to unpack precisely what that looks like and some of the rationale behind it and some of the effects that this process might have on the knowledge networks of the Camayoc. To do so, we need to come to the first manual that was produced by APEBA for assessing Camayoc knowledge and expertise. And it is a manual of competency norms that establish what is and is not Camayoc knowledge. Within that, there's 12 units, and each of the units has 5 to 8 functional fulfillments that are measured according to performance criteria and desirable attitudes. So I'm just going to go through an example now. It's going to be a bit of text coming up on the screen, but I'm going to take you through it sort of step by step. You don't need to take the time to try and read every word. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the functional maps for one of the modules, and that is the reproductive management of cattle. Of course, each one has a title. There's then a description about what the Camayoc should and shouldn't be doing according to this module, which starts to frame the practices of the Camayoc. We then see a list of functional fulfillments that the Camayoc have to illustrate their competency in, their abilities. There's 5 to 8 for each module. This one happens to have 5, with one of them broken down into 3 parts. And we'll focus on that one, the conduct of artificial insemination. And I'm going to focus on part A, identifying and manipulating females in heat. This is just a random example that I've used. And really, I just want to show this kind of page about the ways in which Camayoc are now being assessed. So here's the fulfillment, the conduct, to conduct the process of artificial insemination, considering the standards and recommendations of hygiene and care of the livestock. We see a range of performance criteria and a range of evidence that the Camayoc have to demonstrate that they have in order to get this certificate. We see evidence of knowledge and a range of application. We even see a list of desirable attitudes, which varies from module to module, which starts to determine how Camayoc should and shouldn't behave as knowledge distributors. This is significant because we then empower APEBA evaluators, and these are quite vague, as you can see here. We empower the APEBA evaluators to say whether or not a Camayoc is performing as a person in the ways in which they see suits them best. So there's just a couple of components I want to pull out here. One is that Camayoc practices are laid out in black and white, literally on a page, but also this isn't like any other, or this isn't like a normal educational curricula. There's no sliding scale of educational achievement. They either prove these abilities or they don't. They're either given a certificate as a Camayoc or they're not. So they're either perceived as a Camayoc by the state or they're not a Camayoc. And that, I think, is important. Also, by fixing these indicators in the manuals, we're also fixing what the idea of the Camayoc is in time. These kinds of knowledge are then fixed across time so that Camayoc knowledge It's no longer this dynamic learning by doing that I introduced earlier. It starts to become a fixed performative component of Andean life, basically meeting the requirements of the Peruvian state. But it's also designed for replicability. The whole point of this process is so that a Kamaok in Cusco can be measured and assessed according to the same dynamics as a rural promoter in a northern department of Cajamarca. So we start to move from the contextual component of a Kamaok to a more universal idea of rural extensionists across Peru, and they're supposed to be able to be compared side by side. I just want to tease out a few broader implications of this to sum up this process before moving on to the alpaca element. So we start to see the manipulation of animals and animal bodies according to Western standards and practices like artificial insemination, hormones, and antibiotics and so on. I'm not making any normative assumptions about whether that's good or bad or whether they should or should not. I'm just trying to illustrate that the packaging underneath this paper framework is starting to implement new forms of knowledge, new ways of doing things by the Kamaok. These desirable attitudes that I mentioned mean that the promoters must extend their practices according to Western standards and norms of education. We start to shift from this dynamic learning by doing to more didactic forms of education, sort of teaching people in classrooms, standing in front of them, talking. The design for replication means that Kamaok are assessed in the same ways as those in other parts of Peru, moving from this local and contextual component to the national and universal. From aprender a hacer, learning by doing, to a more static state of saber hacer, or know-how on display. So I just want to leave this section by asking a question of where this leaves the idea of decolonial practice, pointed to by Silvia Rivera Kusakianki. I'm not going to answer the question now or even at the end, but I just want you to think through some of the things I introduced earlier in terms of decolonial praxis and whether the incorporation into the paper framework might change that. I'm going to go on and introduce the alpaca component, which introduces a whole new range of rationales behind why we may want to incorporate Kamaok into the national governance frameworks. And to do so, we can again turn back to the manuals, the indicators, the criteria for assessment of the Kamaok, and this time focus on production chains. The whole rationale behind these indicators for assessing Kamaok around alpacas is to improve the production chains related to alpaca products. So by way of a bit of context about that, I'm going to be focusing on the Soluciones Prácticas project, Proyecto Pacocha, which means Project Alpaca. And this was introduced as part of the experiment to expand the APEBA framework across Peru. And it fits within that organization-wide notion of community-based extension systems that I mentioned. So we see a shift from the Kamaok Training School to the more diffuse notion of the Center for Innovation and Rural Agribusiness, neither of which are particular places. They're programs that sort of diffuse out there in the Andes, if you will. And we start to see an emphasis on innovation in agribusiness, on connecting to markets, improving productivity, and so on. So in 2010, Soluciones Prácticas introduced Proyecto Pacocha with the aims of improving alpaca production and reproduction in terms of animal health and breeding, improving wool production quality, and this element of collective commercialization, which I won't focus too much on today. But to tell this story, I need to interrupt it somewhat just to compare the APEBA framework to the traditional relationship between Kamaok and alpacas, which is why they are framed as a decolonial possibility in the first place. They're said to uphold human-animal relationships in the Andes, reciprocal relationships. So the Quechua term of Pacocha is important here because it comes from Paco, animal, and Cha, with affect. They are affective animals. They're engaged in affective relationships with humans. This has upheld Kamaok alpaca relationships for a long time, including under the Inca, as I illustrated earlier. NGOs today are attempting to revive these notions as well, such as reviving the traditional Andean breeding calendar. So as the decolonial scholar Grimaldo Rengifo put it, just as we nurture the alpacas, they nurture us. There's supposed to be a reciprocal relation here amongst alpacas and Kamaiok. So as I go through the APEBA framework, we'll start to question whether that reciprocal relation still can be said to exist for Kamaiok trained in that way. So again, I'm going to come back to some of the indicators, some of those criteria for assessing Kamaiok. There'll be a bit of text again, but I'm going to highlight sections, take you through what I think are some of the key elements. So again, we have some of those, the name and description of the modules and the functional fulfillments. The idea originally was just to replicate that for cattle, which obviously wouldn't have been a great idea. So what we have instead are just 3 modules for the alpaca component. And I'm going to show how those modules combine this culturally appropriate discourse about the Kamaiok, about traditions and histories, with the market-based rationale for improving productivity in the Andes. So the first one, reproductive management of domesticated camelids, alpacas. We see a combining of cultural context with the productivity required by the market. And I'm going to show how this takes shape in a couple of the modules. So we see best practices and local knowledges in part 1A in terms of the productive management of camelids. We see the cultural components, reviving the traditional breeding calendar, doing so in accordance to local resources and climatic conditions. We see that coming together with an emphasis on productivity, greater numbers of offspring, higher fertility, and market trends in order to respond to market trends, in fact. I'm going to skip 1B and turn to the second and third components, which then shift attention away from breeding and animal husbandry in general to the production of goods derived from alpacas. The first one is about shearing. And we see an emphasis on electromechanical shearing and the benefits that that will have, entirely framed in terms of market requirements, competitiveness, better yields, the technical standards and market requirements of the alpaca sector. And we start to see an element of processing the goods in order to maximize yields and to maximize the revenue gained through market interactions. And that takes us to the final component of classifying alpaca fiber. The point to note here is that fiber comes in various grades and that you only get as much money as the common denominator. So you can only get X amount of money according to the lowest quality grade that you have in your spool. So separating it out means that you can get the maximum revenue. So classifying fiber here, framed in terms of competitive management, and according to the Peruvian market standards. Again, I'm not making any normative assessments about whether Kamaiok should or should not engage in the market and all these kind of trends and shifts. But what I am trying to say is that we start to see this rationale underpin Kamaiok training, and so it has an effect on the kinds of knowledge and practices that they then engage in and extend. And I know this is the case because it happens in workshops like this one that I went to in 2011. This is a workshop on the participatory diagnostics of market systems in which Kamaiok are being trained as part of this APEBA framework. It happens in scenarios like this where Kamaiok learn to position themselves in relation to the market dynamics of alpaca-related production. We see them identify the situations that APEBA has outlined, the animal husbandry, the shearing, artisanal production, the processing of fiber, and then the retail components. They're encouraged to abandon traditional practices like traditional shearing and instead adopt new techniques, electromechanical processes for shearing and fleecing. They're schooled in how to then process those fleeces and separate the wool. They're trained to know which types of wool are worth more, which types of wool can be dyed and should be dyed, which kinds of wool are left in natural colors, and which will be a better market benefit. They're trained in processes like this artificial insemination, assisted reproduction. And they're trained in places like Pacomarca, which is a genetic experimentation center in the department of Puno. This is significant because Kamaiok go to places like Pacomarca for a period of about 2 weeks during the APEBA training program and learn about these practices. Obviously, they're not going to go to the field with this kind of setup, but they are learning how to manipulate alpaca genetics, how to select animals, how to assist in reproduction. There's an interesting side note about alpaca reproduction that you can't actually freeze male semen for alpacas, so that constrains the kind of spatial element of assisted reproduction. You can't say, take some semen from a male in Cajamarca and then send it to Canada and then reproduce with females here, unlike pretty much the majority of all other livestock. So that adds an interesting element that you have to have the male sort of live and present at the time of conducting artificial insemination. So that's why they're learning some of these techniques. And it's important that they go to a place like Pacamarca, because Pacamarca is funded by the company Inca Tops. Inca Tops is one component of the Inca group, which is one of 3 corporate giants in the Peruvian alpaca sector. So you don't need to divulge all of this network, but it's important to note that the Camayok and the small alpaqueros are up here, and they contribute 85% of alpaca products in the country. That's a significant proportion, to say the least. It's actually quite large, but the significance here is that most of it flows to that national industry in terms of value-added production. The blue lines indicate the routes from the small alpaqueros. So 82% of their production ultimately flows through a series of intermediaries and commercial agents and ends up in national industry, where these 3 corporate giants add value to the alpaca products and gain the large proportion of the revenues from the improved alpaca wool and genetic quality of the alpacas that the Camayok are engaged in. So the reason I put this up is just to show you how this market rationale underpins a lot of the training that is now going on behind the scenes with the Camayok. Camayok are trained to position themselves in these market dynamics so that the corporate groups like Inca Group will benefit by gaining greater revenues from their wool. That's not the only story going on, but that's definitely part of it. When we unpack those IPEVA frameworks, I think it's quite clear that the market rationale comes through the strongest. So they're trained, to borrow Monica DeHart's term, to be ethnic entrepreneurs. They're trained to position themselves reflexively in global value chains in order to better themselves in relation to market dynamics. This, I think, contrasts that historic narrative that I presented earlier about why Camayok should be important knowledge communicators in the first place. We shift away from that cultural contextual component to a sort of market-based rationale for training, improving productivity, improving Peruvian competitiveness, as well as the competitiveness of rural areas. So to more or less sum up from that, I don't have any categorical conclusions about the metaphor or the practice, and I certainly don't want to say that the Camayok exist on some kind of continuum from one to the other, because there isn't a continuum between these forms of decolonization, even if they exist. But something I haven't really unpacked too much today, for time constraints largely, is that Camayok practices do reaffirm Andean ways of being, dynamic Andean forms of knowledge production and reproduction as a kind of practice, and customary forms of governing Andean agrarian ecologies. I know this because I accompanied quite a few Camayok around the field. I spent some time with them. I lived with them for periods of time. I've seen their relationships with animals. I've seen their relationships with other campesinos. They're not all going out there just to maximize revenue in terms of improving their wool production. But at the same time, the IPEVA frameworks that I set out today professionalize Camayok according to rationales of productivity and market competitiveness, and they fix Camayok knowledge both in time, in time, and then universalize it across space in attempting to expand this network across Peru. So if you really wanted a sort of grand take-home message from all of that, I suppose I would argue that we need this kind of critical and reflexive work on what environmental governance frameworks do when they incorporate these forms of knowledge and knowledge exchange. We start to see that when they get fixed in these indicators, we may in fact be starting to transform and perhaps undermine the very things that they're designed to support and perhaps protect. In this case, Camayok knowledge is no longer able to perform that dynamic learning by doing function once they get involved in this paper certification program. They start to get fixed by these Peruvian state ideas about what camo knowledge should and shouldn't be. So that's more or less what I have to say today. With that, I'll just acknowledge some of the key people that helped me with the research, particularly this is Carlos de la Torre, who I mentioned earlier, who was described by Juan Camayoc as the godfather of the Camayoc school. So he's been instrumental not only to my research, but also to the very recognition that Camayoc can play an important role in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Yates, for a very rich presentation about the intersection of Camayoc, NGOs, the private sector of the state with respect to the complexities of decolonizing world development and the humanities. I'd like to invite questions from the audience.
Of course.
Any questions?
It depends. So there's various ways in which, so for example, in terms of alpaca production, they may be privately owned herds, but they may graze on common land. Or they may collectivize their herds somewhat and share the herds amongst a local association. So it really depends on where you go and which community that you're talking to. But more often than not, they'll have private herds that will then rotate amongst different lands. Sometimes they'll be on their private land, but when it's waterlogged, they'll share land with other campesinos and neighbors and so on. So, I mean, it's complicated, but yeah. Yeah, so government agricultural extension in Peru got scaled back dramatically in the 1980s. It does still exist, but largely in the form of research in places like the Agrarian University in Lima, as well as others. And then what they do is they develop the knowledge and the skills and seed varieties, potato varieties, or what have you. And then it's diffused in two ways that have emerged in the 1980s as a result of those neoliberal scaling backs of the government programs, either through private mechanisms, the private sector, or through NGOs taking up the slack. So what I've presented is the NGO side to that story and the ways in which Camayoc are being enrolled in agricultural extension. But you also have private corporations going out there and selling agricultural innovation. Decreasingly, do you have the state directly involved? You may have the state contract some scientists or private sector agricultural extension agents to go and do that work. So how do they compete? I wouldn't say that they're competing, other than the fact that they're not competing because they're distributing different kinds of knowledge. See what I mean? The private sector will be distributing much larger volumes and different kinds of inputs than the Camayoc will be engaged with. The farmers that the Camayoc are engaging with, they may have a mixed herd of like 20 alpacas and llamas, and they may have a small pasture, and then they may have a small crop of potatoes and leafy vegetables and so on. So, in terms of information, I don't know about that. I don't think so, because if you go to places like the Agrarian University in Lima, they are also working on things like reviving traditional potato varieties and trying to distribute that knowledge to our Andean farmers, because those are the ones that grow best, and they're going to revive those markets. Meanwhile, they're also growing potatoes on the coast that they can export to other countries because they grow better on the coast. So, yeah. Hey. Yeah, there's two answers to that, at least. One is that all of my research focused on a relative element of professionalizing CAMAOC. So I entered this program through the Soluciones Practicas, the NGO that was training them. There's actually still CAMAOC that exist in some communities. I visited one where they don't engage with NGOs at all, and they actually have an annual cycle of CAMAOC who are elected each year to perform a certain role. The community I went to was just to guard potato crops and to ensure that they produce well enough. So that still exists in different places, but in the areas where I worked where the NGOs and the state were involved, there's actually some frictions emerging between, for example, Amarcas, that association that I presented earlier that was involved. They've left the APEBA system because they're not happy with the kinds of training that Soluciones Practicas is doing, and the APEBA framework, which is making CAMAOC knowledge and practices very much more rigid. And so they've left and they're trying to set up their own system of protecting CAMAOC knowledge and validating them, including more attention to women and so on, and the gender differences. So those conflicts do exist. I'm not entirely sure what the effects will be on individual CAMAOC who haven't gone through this system, because my focus was always on the system and the CAMAOC that went through it. You see what I mean? In a research sense. There's definitely work to be done out there, going back to the Andes and looking at communities where they haven't even engaged in NGO projects and what CAMAOC roles they perform in those areas. Yeah, it's predominantly agriculture. Often it's a mix of subsistence agriculture with a limited degree of market production, which is increasing. The proportion is increasing. And what this program is designed to do is make CAMAOC employable in other senses. So they will take that certificate and go work for a municipality or an NGO in an attempt to sort of diversify the employment base in these areas. But a lot of them are so remote that they're not engaging in market towns very frequently. They'll go once a week to a market town at most, and a lot of their work, a lot of their time is spent producing for themselves, and they still exchange reciprocally with their neighbors, so there'll be a lot of mutual exchange and barter and so on. It's a very good question, yeah, because actually what I didn't say today was about that very process, about how the evolution of the APEBA framework. And it happened in consultation with groups like Soluciones Practicas. They were brought in very early because they had this model of training CAMAOCs. They were brought in as consultants along with some other institutions, and then those consultants said, okay, we need to ask CAMAOC what their knowledge is. And so they set up a series of roundtables and participatory processes with CAMAOC to figure out what these indicators should potentially look like. What has happened since then is that as the program has started to expand, we basically see the early formulation of what CAMAOC knowledge could possibly be is then put onto paper, and then we just see a sort of, what would you call it, like a transmogrification or transformation of that as the programs expand, rather than going back to CAMAOC and saying, in each case, in each place, in terms of each area of production, and saying, what kind of knowledge do we need to recognize here? They've taken their first template and then they just adapt that to wherever it goes. Somewhat. So certificates are awarded on a 5-year basis. So at the end of that 5 years, in theory, this hasn't happened yet. So actually, it should have happened. It should happen this year. Would be the end of the first round of certification. So after that 5-year process, a CAMAOC goes back and they have to reperform the exams that they took. In theory, the knowledge indicators could have changed to reflect changes in CAMAOC practices or what have you. Part of what I have to do if I take this writing further is to update my analysis to find out if that's taking place, if so, how, and whether or not Camelot can advance with this system of if they keep having to go back and take the same exams and so on. I'm more interested in seeing how, well, maybe they can build on one layer and then advance to another layer. I don't want to call them levels. I don't want to create this sort of hierarchy of attainment, but we need a way of ensuring that Camelot knowledge may be progressing in a dynamic way rather than just sort of going in a stagnant cycle, if you see what I mean.
I'm more interested in the mechanisms they have to work with all knowledge.
Yeah, it's just that 5-year process, but yeah.
Every 5 years is what updating.
Yeah, I mean, that's not in writing. The idea is that they have this certificate for 5 years because it may not be so relevant in 5 years. They actually want to test them again to make sure that it's still doing what they were tested to do in the first place, that they still have that knowledge. It's not in writing and it's not in practice that they're actually revamping the indicators that I outlined today. Yeah. Yeah, so I've presented sort of a one side to the story, if you like. There's other NGOs operating in the Peruvian Andes that aren't tied into the APEBA framework, who work with people like the Kamaok and the term Yachachic, which is used kind of interchangeably with Kamaok. And they're working with them to revive their practices, not engaging in any certification process, just empower them through other means. And they're the ones that are really talking about the decolonial potential of them and reviving agrarian lives and livelihoods in Peru and reaffirming the cultures around those livelihoods. So they're not engaged so much in this sort of neo-colonial, post-colonial governance frameworks that I outlined today. So that's kind of where I wanted to present these frameworks, just to say, well, if we're framing them as decolonial and we're trying to incorporate them into these environmental governance frameworks, what exactly is going on and what is the work being done by those frameworks? Yeah.
Is there any intellectual property attached to any of the methodologies that have been described as, say, indigenous people usually can describe themselves that, and then this NGO can say, well, these are the methodology or something like that?
Not that I know of, is the short answer. Yeah. Thanks.